Yoga Sutras of Patanjali seen in relation to Sufism, and particularly in relation to the teachings of Hazrat Pir Zia Inayat. So we're partway into it now. We've gotten up to the analysis of the workings of the mind and the categorization of these workings in 5 categories. And we see how Patanjali has given one categorization and Biruni has interpreted it and associated Arabic technical terms with each of the categories, which enables us to put it in conversation with Sufism. And then we find that 3 of the categories reappear in Murshid's analysis of the mind, and there are 2 others in Murshid's model that aren't accounted for in this model. And we even had a chance afterward to experientially observe each of the 5 aspects that Murshid describes. So let's go further now. And in the subsequent verses, we find that having defined yoga as the cessation of the turnings of thought, Patanjali now speaks of what this path consists of, what enables a person to cease the mental activity that is so habitual to us. And he designates 2 methods. One is abhyasa, which is practice, and which Biruni translates as ta'weed, which means coming back to something again and again, habituation or training. So the path consists of not only once, but again and again as a discipline, as a rigorous commitment to keep coming back to the kind of withdrawal that Patanjali is speaking about, where thought pulls back from its objects and withdraws into itself and discontinues the churning with which it has been so long preoccupied. So the first method is practice, consistent practice, returning again and again to this discipline. And the second is dispassion or vairagya. Now that may be a familiar term for many of you. Vairagya, it's a word that Murshid himself mentions in several places. And it can be translated as dispassion, or sometimes Murshid uses the word indifference. And it's a state that subsequent to a state of attachment and dependency, when one is able to free oneself from the mental posture of, well, addiction, dependence, habit, the tendency to expect a particular outcome, and for one's own inner state to be dependent on outer circumstances. If one is able to withdraw from that dependency, then one gains a degree of freedom that isn't vulnerable to the vicissitudes of fate. So vairagya, dispassion, which Biruni translates as zud, which is sometimes translated as asceticism. So in Sufi poetry, for instance, the ashik sometimes, even laughs at the zahid. The zahid is the repentant renunciate, but who's seen as dry as dust, as being oblivious to the beauty of creation. So the Sufi tradition is of mixed views on Zud. If you look at the early Sufi corpus produced in southern Iraq, there's a strong emphasis on Zud, taming the wild ego by a strenuous exertion of discipline, fasting, renunciation, little sleep, constant rituals of worship. These are all aspects of Zud, which leads to a state of unworldliness, overcoming, breaking of desires and attachments, and not being dependent on anyone or being driven by one's whimsical inclinations. So that's a theme in Sufism, Zud. But again, the poetry of Hafiz and so many later poets celebrate a Sufism of beauty and of love that doesn't spurn the beauty that manifests in our human life, but celebrates it. So there's you might say, to reach a condition of awakened heart that isn't subject to the imprisoning conditioning that comes with mere reactivity and a kind of narcissistic, egoic heedlessness. One has to go through a kind of zut. One has to go through a transcending of the conditioned and narrow and artificial constraints on the soul. But that may not be the end of the story. It isn't that Zud becomes an end in itself, but it opens out on a path of the heart where beauty can now be witnessed, but without possessiveness and grasping. So these two dimensions, the acidic, rigorous, dry, ascetic path, and the rindi path, the path of the rind. In poetry, the rind is the roguish character that's laughing at the hermit and drinking wine and so forth. These two ways of being are really two dimensions of a full path that applies to all of us. So it's not just one or the other. But here we're speaking of vairagya as zud, as asceticism. At least Al-Biruni is interpreting Patanjali to mean by vairagya zud. And Biruni says that this involves contemplating decay. So whereas someone in the grips of passion might want to latch on to the object of desire and gratify himself or herself immediately, dispassion would involve a longer term view, and a perspective that sees everything as ephemeral and in a process of ultimate decay and transformation. So, you know, the yogis often do inhabit cemeteries and meditate there and drink from skulls as their cup, in order to cultivate this idea that everything is ephemeral and we're all in the process of dying, and therefore to avoid attachment or a kind of superficial relish that is oblivious to the real nature of reality. So Al-Biruni speaks of zuhd and dispassion and vairagya as cognizance of the decay of all things. And of course, this is just the kind of attitude that the Rind is mocking the hermit for displaying, and wanting to say, well, yes, we know that everything is dying, and that's all the more reason to go out and drink a cup. That's the sentiment of Omar Khayyam in the Rubaiyat. So the two methods are practice and dispassion. Now, what are the methods, the comparable methods that Murshid explains? If you look in mental purification, Murshid explains, well, there are many teachings there which are very rich and wide-ranging, but succinctly, he speaks of three methods for purification, mental purification. And these are stilling the mind, breathing well, and a loving attitude. So stilling the mind is really of a piece with Patanjali. Sitting still, being quiet, slowing down. When one ceases to speak, the thoughts themselves start to slow down, and eventually you can experience a silence which isn't only silence of the tongue, but also silence of the mind. So there's a process of settling where the sediment sinks down and the liquid of the mind, so to speak, becomes purified and transparent. The second is breathing well, watching the breath, and in Persian that's called pasi anfas, and guarding the breath, pasi anfas. And that's the word that the Sufis use to describe yogic breathing practices, which they adopted from the yogis in India. And this is freely admitted by Shah Kalimullah Jahanabadi, who wrote the great manual of meditation for the Chishti order, Kashkuli Kalimi. He says that the breathing methods of the Sufis have been learned from the yogis, and he says from Khwaja Khizr, the immortal guide, Khwaja Khizr. And it's interesting that he says that because it does point to a historical reality which would be missed if one only spoke of the yogis as the source for Sufi breath practice. And that is that even before Sufis came to India, in Central Asia, they already had methods of what they would eventually call pasyanfas, guarding the breath. So among the Kwajagan in Central Asia, one of the primary principles, the three primary principles, hosh dar dam, nazar bar qadam, khilvat dar anjuman. Hosh dar dam is the first one, watch your breath, be conscious of your breath. So that was already a tradition among the Sufis, but they were able to further develop and expand their repertoire of breath work in India in conversation with the yogis. And it's also true that yoga itself came to reflect the impact of the methods of the Sufis. So there was a collaboration, but breathing is the second of the three ways that Murshid describes: stilling the mind, breathing, and then the third, he doesn't say in this place, the places he speaks of vairagya, but here he doesn't speak of dispassion or indifference. True, in other places he speaks of indifference and independence as the two wings of the heart. But remember, still there's a heart, and the heart is a principle of love, really. It's the organ of love. So those wings are not attached to something dispassionate. It's the elevation of the passion of the heart through the ennobling influence of vairagya. But here, the third principle is the loving attitude. And this is the way that he explains it. A person may breathe and sit in silence in 1,000 postures. So he's referring, of course, to the asanas. But if he does not have the right attitude towards life, he will never develop. That is the principal thing. But the question is, what is the right attitude? By trying to consider things sympathetically, favorably. So again, remember the expression husn-i zan, a generous, a kind, a beautiful way of thinking. Try to consider things sympathetically, favorably, by looking at others as one looks at oneself. So for oneself, of course, one more readily makes excuses and accommodations and allowances, but for others, you want them to be exactly as you want them to be, and no excuse will do. Well, put yourself in their shoes. So looking at others as one looks at oneself. And thirdly, by putting oneself in their position instead of accusing others and on seeing their infirmities. Concentrating all the time on error means engraving the error upon the mind. The best principle is to forget others and to forget oneself, and to set our minds upon accumulating all that is good and beautiful. Now, to be fair to Patanjali, we have to recognize that he isn't advocating a cold path of apathy. That's not really what he means by vairagya. He's not talking about not caring about others or having no warmth toward them, no kind intentions. Because he says in the verses that follow, tranquility of thought comes from the cultivation of friendship, compassion, joy, and impartiality in spheres of pleasure or pain, virtue or vice. So we are speaking about love. Patanjali and Murshid have that in common. And it's the difference is that it's not love which is limited by egotism, egoical affection, where one has affection for those who can help you, and and disaffection for those who are of no use. So unconditional love is perhaps the best way to put it. Patanjali goes on to say, the cessation of thought may also come from dedication to the Lord of Yoga. Cessation of thought may also come from dedication to the Lord of Yoga. Sorry, I have a little dryness in my throat. If you don't mind, I'm just going to take a quick moment and have a sip of water. I'll be right back. I'm so sorry about that. We were talking about the dryness of the ascetic, and somehow that must have found its way into my throat. But I'm ready to keep going. So the next verse speaks of the cessation of thought. Cessation of thought may also come from dedication to the Lord of Yoga. Cessation of thought may come from dedication to the Lord of Yoga. Now, this is a very significant verse, and one that's been subject to a lot of speculation. Who is the Lord of Yoga? It could have one of several meanings. One is Purusha, which is spirit itself. There's Purusha and Prakriti, spirit and matter. And Purusha is primal, the primal spirit. So it may be that the Lord of Yoga is Purusha. Sometimes Purusha is translated as God, actually. And then it could be Hiranyagarbha. Hiranyagarbha means the golden matrix or the golden embryo. It can mean, Garbha can mean womb or embryo. And you find it also in the Buddhist word Tathagata Garbha. And these are both references to a matrix, which for the Buddhist is the matrix of the Buddhas. And in the Mahabharata, Hiranyagarbha is introduced as the first teacher of yoga. And Shankaracharya refers to Hiranyagarbha as the soul of all souls, the one who, for whom each soul is like a bead, and Hiranyagarbha is the rosary, the soul of all souls. So whereas Purusha is even beyond the totality of souls, Hiranyagarbha is the oversoul, the soul of souls. And really bespeaks that reality that we call in Murshid's vocabulary the spirit of guidance, the one master. So Hiranyagarbha may be the Lord of Yoga, or Shiva. Shiva is often considered to be the chief of the yogis, the greatest yogi of all times, Shiva in his perch on Mount Kailash, with a cobra around his neck. He's the very personification of vairagya, and he may be the Lord of Yoga. So it's ambiguous. Al-Biruni translates, he renders the Lord of Yoga as God. And he says, therefore, that the cessation of thought, glossing Patanjali, the cessation of thought is achieved through ibadah to Allah. Ibadah means, it's difficult to translate exactly. It means service, it means worship, it means servitude. The human being is an abd to the Rabb. Rabb is the one to whom we belong. We who belong are in the service of the one to whom we belong. And we express that service most appropriately in worship and in all acts that are for the sake of that one. So Patanjali is saying that you can bring thought back to its essence. You can cause it to be stilled by dedication to the Lord of Yoga, which for Al-Biruni means serving God. Now onward, there's a further passage in Biruni that has no exact counterpart in Patanjali. You know, Biruni's translation isn't a direct translation. It's a paraphrase that includes interpretation, and it also makes use of commentaries on Patanjali. So here he's talking about, the question is posed, if someone attains liberation, if someone attains, what you could call God consciousness, is that person God? Is there a difference between someone who has attained God consciousness and God? And the answer is that the difference is this, that the divine consciousness is perpetually infinite, whereas a person who attains the divine consciousness does so only relatively, in temporally limited terms. So someone could be conscious of the divine consciousness now, but that same person previously wasn't in that consciousness. And so the difference between God and a creature who attains to God consciousness is that God has always been and will always be in that consciousness. So Biruni might have been thinking of Halaj as the most famous example. Also Bastami, but especially Halaj, when he said, An al-Haq, I am al-Haq, I am the truth, I am God. And it wasn't Halaj who was speaking, it was the divine voice. He was completely absorbed in that infinitude. So was he God? Well, Biruni is saying that what makes God uniquely God is having always been in that state. Then Patanjali goes on to say, that is to say, the Lord of Yoga, the Lord of Yoga's sound is the reverberating syllable Om. Om. Interestingly, Biruni skips this reference. He doesn't refer to Om at all, but instead speaks of the importance of intoning the name of God, which is in our Sufi path, that is the practice of wazifa. You're given a wazifa, you're given a personal practice, which is one of the sifat, one of the qualities of God. And you know that quality by invoking the divine name that represents it. But then you go on from wazifa to zikr, and in zikr you're invoking the isme zat, the name that encompasses all of the qualities, which is Allah, or more essentialized, Hu. So Biruni gently overlooks Om, but Murshid doesn't overlook Om. In the esoteric papers, he speaks of it, and speaks of it as a practice which a Sufi may do. And how does he define it? He defines it by these familiar words: I am that I am. The biblical words, the words of the divine voice spoken to Moses, appearing in the theophany of the burning bush. Ahia asher ahia. I am that I am. Some rabbis translate, the tense of the verb isn't fixed, so it could be I am that I am, or even I am that I become. So Murshid is making a link between Om and that primal declaration of the divine voice. And interestingly, Shah Kalimullah Jahanabadi, in the same manual of meditation I referred to, Kashkuli Kalimi, he references Ahia Asharahia, I am that I am. And he says, in our language of Sufism, that is Hayyu Qayyum. Hayyu Qayyum. Al-Hayy, the living, and Qayyum, the ever-standing. Now, Patanjali goes on, and I'm not reading all of the verses now, just a sample. I encourage you to study the text yourself. I'm using this translation by Barbara Stoller Miller. And it says, here it is. When these turnings of thought stop, a contemplative poise occurs in which thought, like a polished crystal, is colored by what is nearby, whether perceiver, process of perception, or object of perception. And this is how Biruni puts it, and I'm using just a very recent translation of the Arabic into English now, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali translated by Mario Cosa. So in this translation, he becomes like a crystal in which surrounding objects can be seen as though contained in it. Similarly, he will encompass his surroundings so that when knowledge and what is known unite in him as the knower, then the intellect and intellected all become identical for him. So here we have the image of a crystal, of glass, or a transparency. And the meditator takes on this nature. Instead of being opaque, the consciousness of the meditator becomes translucent, transparent. There's still something there, but it is totally accommodating of whatever comes before it. It's not opaque to its experience, but instead it's an accommodation that is in itself empty and invisible, but renders clear all that comes within its fold. Junaid said, water, the color of water is the color of the cup. So that's the condition of pure consciousness. When consciousness is totally clear, you know, muddy water, you put it in a cup, you don't see the color of the cup, you just see the mud in the water. But clear water, you put it in a colored glass, you see right through the water into the glass. That's the state of consciousness that Patanjali is speaking about, that limpid, lucid, clear way of being in which there's no imposition or barrier, just the immediacy of all that is here. And it's reminiscent of a saying that is found in the Nirtan. The Nirtan collects sayings that are, for the most part, Murshid's lattermost sayings at the end of his life. And this is one of them. You know, in his poems, Murshid is always in conversation with stones and trees and streams. And here he's in conversation with a crystal. Crystal, what are you? I am the shadow of Christ's heart. What quality do you possess? I am empty of self, so that by gazing, one sees in me his heart reflected. Now, at the end of this verse, Patanjali speaks of the knower, the known, and knowledge. And this is a subject that Murshid takes up throughout his teachings in various places. This trinity, or to use the Hindustani word trimurti, you know, the figures who are called devas, and which Biruni and the Sufi tradition in India call malaika, angels and archangels. These have amongst them a constellation of three who are of special primacy, and they are Brahma and Vishnu and Shiva. And Brahma is associated with creation, Vishnu with preservation, and Shiva with destruction. And Murshid sees this Trimurti as expressive of something inherent in reality, which is lover, love and beloved, or knower, knowledge and known. You find the same threefold conjunction in metaphysics and epistemology throughout Murshid Sufism and in Sufism more widely. And I think it was yes, who was it? The Persian Sufi poet who understood the Christian Trinity in precisely these terms, not as implying a violation of the divine unity, but as expressive of the nature of consciousness in manifestation. So Murshid says, occult power is the power of knowing or seeing, the faculty of knowing or seeing. The seer is the greatest of these aspects. The second is that which is seen, and the seeing power is the third. So the primary one is the knower. Second is what is known, and third, the knowledge itself. And this observation too lends itself to contemplative practice, because Patanjali is saying here that the consciousness knows itself in all of these three modes now and can experience them simultaneously. So experientially, this means that you could practice taking up an object of attention. Maybe there's something on your desk, a stone maybe, and gaze at it, take it into your mind, and then notice what's happening. First, there is your act of seeing and knowing. You're looking out on the stone, and it's the object of your consciousness, and your vision of it depends on the condition of your eyes, the condition of your mind. It says very much about you. You know, different people will look at the same thing and come to very different conclusions because of what's in their mind already. So the first part of this practice is just to own your part of that act, your seeing of it. That's what you bring. You're bringing your sight to the encounter and meeting it, meeting the thing. And if it were not for this act on your part, there would be no seeing. So you're conscious of your own active act of seeing and knowing coming from your own side, and that means limited by your subjectivity. But that's not all that's happening. You're also encountering something, and that other thing is necessary for that encounter to occur. So what is that thing? Someone else could see it, and a third person could see it, and they would all still be seeing that same thing. You need not be there. That thing has a life of its own. So then you think of the nature of the thing, the existence of the thing beyond your act of knowing. The known itself, whether you know it or not, it's still the known. And it could be known by any number of knowers. It has a life beyond your knowing. So it's like pivoting in your contemplation. First, you're in your own point of view, but then you pivot and identify with the object itself, beyond you. In you now in this encounter, but having a life of its own beyond you, just as you have a life beyond it. And then the third is the knowledge itself, which is the conjunction of these two things. Your personal knowing and the thing as it is. These two things coming together produce this moment, this experience, this sensation. Which unites you and what you're seeing. So this is a contemplation one can return to in day-to-day life. We have a tendency to keep coming back to our own subjectivity and even to experience that as somehow objective. But what we're called on to do here is to see our glance as one angle of vision, now intersecting with an object, then experience the object now as a subject itself, meeting your glance, and then the knowledge that transpires between the two. Further on, Patanjali speaks about four different modes in which an object can be conceived. The first is with respect to its particulars, just the concrete immediacy of what's there. But the second is the definitions that apply to it. So it belongs to a species, it has these definable characteristics, you're identifying it. That's the second dimension. The third is that it's unified, but time-bound. So unified means that it's more than just a definable thing. In the language of Sufism, we would say that it has an imaginative life in the mind world that physically manifests in this thing, but which isn't limited to your analysis of that thing. And then fourthly, the dimension of it that's unified and timeless. Even the alama mithal is subject to temporality, but here you become aware of that thing's basis in the implicate order, the timeless reality that has no beginning or end. So 4 levels of encounter with what we meet. And these levels bear comparison with Murshid's 4 stages on the spiritual path, which are, first of all, concentration, or mujahida, which means just focusing on something. And that correlates with both particulars and definitions. But then you have, secondly, muraqaba, which is contemplation, and that takes you into the imaginal world, and that takes you into the dimension of something that's unified but time-bound. So you're contemplating something beyond its sensory appearance. And then you have mushahada, which is meditation, which is beyond the time-bound dimension. When everything is simultaneous and ultimately united in a oneness that transcends the divergent dimensions of manifestation. And that's the unbound state. Everything is subject to binding and constraint because of our perspective. But when the perspective itself unravels, then everything unravels into a primal unity. And that's meditation. But then beyond meditation is mu'ayyana, which is realization. which means that now you experience all of these things simultaneously. So it's not, you're not only conscious of the state of unity beyond manifestation, you're also conscious of the specificity of things, their time-bound dimension, and even their characteristics and particulars, the whole gamut. That's Moyana. And these are the stages of consciousness on the path. So there's a real correlation here, a connection between what Murshid is saying and Patanjali. Now, we're coming, I realize time is passing. We're coming to the end. And at the end of chapter 1, Patanjali makes a distinction between seed-bearing thoughts and seedless ones. Seed-bearing wisdom and seedless wisdom. So seed-bearing wisdom is conventional wisdom, theology, metaphysics. All of that is seed-bearing, which means that there's a concept that leads syllogistically to another concept, and you elaborate propositions and you create a whole philosophy. And it's of the nature of thought in general, where one thought leads to another and it just keeps going. And this has to do with the churnings of the mind. So there's this constant propagation of thought, and one can have all kinds of interesting conversations, but it's all operating on a plane of becoming. And beyond becoming, there is what one may know as being itself, and that is seedless wisdom, not sarbija, but nirbija. And so seedless wisdom is a thought that doesn't lead beyond itself. It ends there. It just is what it is, and that's final. And that's what Patanjali is drawing our attention toward. Now, how does this relate to Sufism? Well, the image of the seed, the metaphor of the seed, is a very important one, both in Hinduism and in Sufism. And in both traditions, if you go back to the real roots of these traditions, the seed is a generative concept. Patanjali uses it as the example of a proliferation of thought that ultimately one wants to avoid. But if one goes right back to the Vedas, to the Nasadya Sukta, which is the Genesis account in the Vedas, you find this saying, this verse: desire came upon that one in the beginning. That was the first seed of mind. Now, who the one is, the whole Nasadya Sukta is so mysterious and ambiguous. There's no definite answer as to who that one is or what was going on. But this is as close as the Nasadya Sukta comes to making a definite statement when it says that desire came to that one in the beginning. That was the first seed of mind. Mind comes out of this primal desire. And really, this is the intuition of Sufism reflected in the famous hadith of the hidden treasure. Kuntu kanzan makfiyan, I was a hidden treasure and I desired to be known. Ahbabtu an urafa, a hidden treasure. Well, a seed is a hidden treasure, isn't it? Because inside the seed is a whole tree, but it's hidden. Not only it's hidden in the ground, it's hidden in that little minute shell. And yet it contains so much that is destined to bear fruit. And I long to be known. Ahbabtu an urafa. And the word ahbabtu means I long to be known. It's related to hub, muhabbat, hub. Hub means love. I loved, I yearned. But hub is etymologically related to hab. And hab means seed. Hub and hab are of the same nature. So love was a seed. And in fact, the Quran speaks of God as the opener of the seed. So for someone walking the Sufi path to read Patanjali and to be encouraged to find seedless wisdom rather than seed-bearing wisdom, one is sort of halted in one's tracks. And one wonders whether in this way something would be missed, something that is necessary in the seed. Now one understands that he is meaning to inculcate an ability that is so rare and yet so important, which is that all of us are so preoccupied with the circumstances around us and so constantly reacting to them that we lack the ability to withdraw, to go within, to go into the center of our being, and in that way to be free, to be not so subject to conditioning, and in that way to be so predictable, frankly. We become very predictable unless we're able to free ourselves in this way. And so he needs to give us strong medicine. And that medicine is the medicine of withdrawal and dispassion and so forth. But if we follow the Sufi path, well, we can hold this wisdom in the highest esteem and gratitude. We'll also inevitably feel that there's something in the seed, there's something in unfurling, there's something in the very journey of the soul and its experience in manifestation that is significant. And that is something that Patanjali doesn't want to dwell on. One might think of the case of the Buddha. The Buddha was asked about God. Is there a God? The Buddha didn't want to say that there's a God or there's no God. He didn't want to talk about it. He only said, we're in pain and there's a method for addressing this pain. Now, Patanjali saw a need and addressed this need, but he didn't want to talk about what our own Sheikh al-Mashaykh has described as the second of these two fundamental aspects of Murshid's teachings. One is the ultimate personal realization of the soul's illuminative reality as the condition and essence of all existence. Yes, Patanjali is right there. But also, Sheikh al-Mashaykh says, the cultivation of personality and human life's values. That's where the unfurling of the seed has significance, and the way that a tree germinates and pollinates another tree and flowers come. So Murshid handles this dilemma very tactfully, I think, and reconciles the 2 points of view when he says, man mistakes when he begins to cultivate the heart by wanting to sow the seed himself instead of leaving the sowing to God. So by all means, let there be a seed and let it unfurl, but let the sower be God. And so ultimately, Murshid's teaching totally affirms the wisdom of Patanjali and also recognizes a dimension that perhaps Patanjali wasn't interested in addressing in the Yoga Sutras. Because the Yoga Sutras end with this observation: freedom is a reversal of the evolutionary course of material things. which are empty of meaning for the spirit. So going back to the origin, reversing the course of things, spirit has dissipated itself in a false consciousness and needs to rediscover its own innate transparency. This is the message of Patanjali. Murshid affirms it and says something still more. And I'll leave you, having already taken so much time, I'll leave you with these concluding words of Murshid's that I believe both affirm yoga and also affirm our embodied human condition and the heart's flowering and all that it brings. The soul manifests in the world in order that it may experience the different phases of manifestation and yet not lose its way, but regain its original freedom in addition to the experience and knowledge it has gained in this world. And with this, I turn back to you, dear Aulia.
Yeah, thank you so very, very much. We have been spellbound by everything you have given us this afternoon and this evening. This an enormously enriching view of the Indian tradition of Patanjali, the interpretations of Al-Biruni, and then, of course, how Murshid develops his own ideas on the basis of these, and kind of I see. Well, all right. So I'm asked to turn this way and repeat myself once again. But I think all of you will agree with me that this was an enormously enriching treasure of wisdom which Pir Zia has given us this afternoon and this evening with this comparison of Patanjali and his interpretation through Al-Biruni, and then how Murshid, building upon these traditions, presents something entirely, entirely novel, again, out of these old traditions, something highly personal, highly contemporary for our present time. But the way of dealing with the subject to this extent has just been wonderful. That is a wholly new approach of our standing of Murshid Sufism. And, well, we can only be enormously grateful for the way in which you, Pir Zia, have given us this perspective, this novel understanding, and this further perspective for proceeding along Murshid Sufism. We hope to be illuminated by your further leadership and wisdom, and thank you for all that you have given us at this day of the beginning of our 10-day meetings. Again, thank you so much on behalf of all of us. Jazakallah.